What happens when a respected actor sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has a hidden agenda that will turn a simple conversation into television chaos? This is exactly what unfolded when Walton Goggins appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live, expecting to promote his latest project but instead walking into what can only be described as an ambush. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation as Walton Goggins made his entrance, that familiar, Southern charm radiating from him as he waved and took his seat across from Jimmy Kimmel. The cameras rolled, the lights were bright, and everything seemed perfectly normal for what viewers expected to be another entertaining celebrity interview. "Walton Goggins, everybody," Jimmy announced with his trademark grin, though something seemed slightly off about his demeanor. "Great to have you back on the show." "Always a pleasure, Jimmy," Walton replied, settling into the guest chair with his characteristic ease. "Thanks for having me." "So let's talk about your new series," Jimmy began, but his tone carried an undertone that seasoned television watchers might recognize as trouble brewing. "You're playing another complex character, another guy with questionable morals. I'm starting to see a pattern here." Walton chuckled, assuming this was just typical late-night banter. "Well, I suppose I've been fortunate to work with writers who understand that the most interesting characters are the ones who live in the gray areas of life." "Gray areas," Jimmy repeated, his smile becoming more forced. "That's one way to put it. But let's be honest here, Walton. You seem to have a real affinity for playing criminals, degenerates, and generally unsavory people. What does that say about you as a person?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Walton's expression shifted slightly, the easy smile faltering as he processed what had just been said. The studio audience, sensing the sudden tension, grew noticeably quieter. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you asking me, Jimmy?" Walton's voice remained steady, but there was a clear edge creeping in. "I'm asking if there's something about these roles that speaks to you personally," Jimmy pressed on, leaning forward with the predatory instinct of someone who smells blood in the water. "I mean, you've played a white supremacist, a corrupt sheriff, various criminals. Normal actors might shy away from such consistently dark material." Walton sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Jimmy, I think you might be misunderstanding what acting is. We don't play characters because we identify with them personally. We play them because they're well-written and challenging." "Come on, Walton," Jimmy said with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "You can't tell me there isn't some part of you that connects with these characters. Otherwise, how would you be so convincing? Are you seriously suggesting that I'm somehow similar to the characters I portray?" Walton's voice was rising slightly, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Because that's a pretty serious accusation you're making on national television." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that this interview had taken a very dark turn. Jimmy, however, seemed to be enjoying himself, as if he had been planning this confrontation all along. "I'm not making accusations," Jimmy said with mock innocence. "I'm just asking questions that I think our viewers are curious about. You have to admit, it's unusual for an actor to be so consistently drawn to playing the villain." "Drawn to playing the villain?" Walton repeated, his southern accent becoming more pronounced as his irritation grew. "Jimmy, I've played heroes, anti-heroes, complex characters across the entire spectrum of human behavior. You're cherry-picking specific roles to create some kind of narrative that simply doesn't exist." "But those aren't the roles people remember you for, are they?" Jimmy countered, his tone becoming more aggressive. "When people think Walton Goggins, they think of the racist Boyd Crowder or the psychotic Shane from The Shield. Those are your signature performances. Those are complex characters that required me to dig deep as an actor," Walton shot back, his professional facade beginning to crack. "Boyd Crowder wasn't just a racist. He was a man trying to escape his circumstances, while being trapped by his upbringing. Shane Vendrell was a corrupt cop struggling with loyalty and paranoia. These aren't one-dimensional villains. They're human beings with flaws and contradictions. Human beings with flaws and contradictions, Jimmy mocked. That sounds like something someone would say to justify their own questionable behavior. The words hit Walton like a physical blow. His eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment it looked like he might stand up and walk off the set. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Jimmy, I came here tonight to talk about my work, to entertain your audience, and to be a good guest on your show. But if you want to turn this into some kind of character assassination, then we need to have a very different conversation." "Character assassination?" Jimmy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking. Why do you think casting directors keep calling you for these types of roles? Maybe they see something in you that the rest of us are just now starting to notice." That was the moment when something snapped inside Walton Goggins. The careful control he had been maintaining suddenly evaporated, and the rage that had been building throughout this ambush interview finally found its voice. "You know what, Jimmy?" Walton's voice cut through the studio like a blade, his composure finally shattered. "You want to know what I think? I think you're a coward who hides behind jokes and cheap shots because you don't have the talent or the courage to have a real conversation." The studio audience gasped audibly. This was not the polite, controlled confrontation they might have expected. This was raw, unfiltered anger from a man who had been pushed too far. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Whoa, Walton. I think you're taking this a little too seriously. This is just a late-night talk show. We're just having fun here." "Having fun?" Walton stood up from his chair, his full height imposing as he looked down at Jimmy. "You think ambushing a guest with personal attacks is fun? You think trying to humiliate someone on national television is entertainment?" "Sit down, Walton," Jimmy said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine concern, as he realized he might have miscalculated. "Let's just take a breath here and get back to the interview." "No, I will not sit down," Walton declared, his voice echoing through the studio. "You started this, Jimmy, so let's finish it. You want to talk about questionable behavior? Let's talk about a host who invites guests onto his show under false pretenses just so he can tear them down for cheap laughs." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented meltdown. The studio audience was frozen, unsure whether to laugh, applaud, or simply watch in horrified fascination. "You're being ridiculous," Jimmy said, but his usual confidence was clearly shaken. "I was just trying to have an interesting conversation about your career choices." "Interesting conversation?" Walton laughed bitterly. "Jimmy, you've been planning this attack from the moment I walked out here. You've been building up to this character assassination, and now you want to pretend like it's just casual conversation? Look, if you can't handle a few tough questions about your career, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews," Jimmy shot back, his own temper starting to flare as he felt his control of the situation slipping away. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. Walton's eyes blazed with fury as he pointed directly at Jimmy. "Tough questions? You call insinuating that I'm personally similar to criminals and racists tough questions? You call suggesting that there's something wrong with me as a person because of the characters I play tough journalism?" "I never said there was anything wrong with you," Jimmy protested weakly. "You absolutely did," Walton fired back immediately. "You sat there and implied that normal actors wouldn't take these roles, that there must be something about me that connects with these dark characters. You questioned my character, my integrity, and my professionalism, all while hiding behind the pretense of entertainment." The studio had become eerily quiet, except for Walton's voice, which seemed to fill every corner of the space. Jimmy was clearly struggling to find a way to regain control of his own show. "Walton, I think you're misinterpreting what I was trying to say," Jimmy attempted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Walton demanded. "Then let me ask you something, Jimmy. When you were preparing for this interview, did you plan to ask me about my charity work? Did you plan to discuss the scholarship fund I established for underprivileged kids in Georgia? Did you plan to talk about the mentorship programs I support for young actors? Jimmy remained silent, his face growing redder by the second. Of course you didn't, Walton continued relentlessly. Because that wouldn't fit your narrative, would it? You wanted to paint me as some kind of method actor who's lost himself in dark roles. You wanted to create controversy and drama at my expense. That's not true, Jimmy protested, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. It's absolutely true, Walton shot back. And you know what the really pathetic part is? You're not even good at it. A real journalist, a real interviewer, would know how to ask challenging questions without resorting to personal attacks and insinuations. The audience was completely silent now, watching this confrontation unfold with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some were clearly on Walton's side, while others seemed shocked by the intensity of his response. You want to know what I think about hosts like you, Jimmy? Walton continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. I think you're threatened by actors who can actually disappear into their roles. I think you're jealous of people who have real talent instead of just the ability to read jokes off cue cards. Now wait just a minute, Jimmy said, finally finding his voice again. You don't get to come on my show and insult me like that. Your show? Walton laughed harshly. Jimmy, this stopped being your show the moment you decided to attack me instead of interview me. You turned this into something ugly, and now you're upset because I'm not just sitting here taking it quietly. You're completely out of line, Jimmy said, his own anger finally bubbling to the surface. I've been nothing but professional with you. Professional? Walton's voice rose to a near shout. You call what you've been doing professional? Jimmy, you wouldn't know professionalism if it slapped you in the face. A professional interviewer prepares thoughtful questions. A professional host treats his guests with respect. A professional comedian doesn't resort to cheap character assassination when he runs out of material. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Security personnel were visible at the edges of the set, clearly unsure whether they should intervene. Jimmy was looking around nervously, as if searching for someone to help him regain control of the situation. I think we need to take a commercial break, Jimmy said desperately, looking toward his producers. Oh no, Walton said firmly. We're not taking a break. You started this public humiliation, and we're going to finish it right here, right now, in front of everyone. You want to finish this? Jimmy said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. Fine. Let's talk about the real reason you're so upset, Walton. Maybe the truth hit a little too close to home. That statement was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Walton's face contorted with rage as he stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, his presence looming over the host who suddenly looked very small in his chair. The truth? Walton's voice was deadly quiet now, more menacing than when he had been shouting. Jimmy, you wouldn't recognize the truth if it was written in 50-foot letters. You sit behind this desk every night making jokes about other people's lives, tearing down celebrities for cheap laughs, and you think that makes you some kind of arbiter of truth? I'm a comedian, Walton. That's what comedians do, Jimmy said weakly, but his usual bravado had completely evaporated. No, Jimmy, that's what hack comedians do, Walton replied with devastating precision. Real comedians find humor in life, without destroying people. Real comedians punch up, not down. Real comedians don't invite people onto their show just to humiliate them. The studio audience was now completely engaged, many of them clearly siding with Walton as they watched their host being systematically dismantled. Some were even nodding in agreement with Walton's words. You know what I think happened here. Tonight, Jimmy? Walton continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I think you thought you could bring me on here and make me your punching bag. I think you thought I'd just sit there and take whatever abuse you wanted to dish out, because that's what you're used to from other guests. That's not what happened, Jimmy protested, but his voice cracked slightly. "It's exactly what happened," Walton shot back immediately. "And you know what the beautiful thing is? Your audience can see it. They can see how you operate, how you treat people, how you hide behind your position of power to attack guests who can't really fight back." Jimmy looked around the studio desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue him from this situation. But his producers, his band, his staff, they were all watching this unfold with the same fascination as the audience. "Except I can fight back. Can't I, Jimmy?" Walton continued relentlessly. "I'm not some young actor desperate for exposure who'll take any abuse just to get on television. I'm not some politician who has to maintain a fake smile no matter what you say. I'm someone who's worked too hard and too long to let a failed comedian tear me down for sport." "Failed comedian?" Jimmy's voice rose defensively. "I have a successful television show." "Do you?" Walton asked with mock curiosity. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you have a platform that you use to compensate for your own insecurities. It looks like you have a bully pulpit that you use to make yourself feel better about your own failures." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jimmy's face had gone completely pale, and for a moment he looked like he might actually cry. "You want to know what I see when I look at you, Jimmy?" Walton asked, his voice now carrying a tone of almost pitying contempt. "I see someone who's so desperate to be relevant that he'll attack anyone, including his own guests, just to create a moment that people will talk about." "Stop," Jimmy said quietly, but Walton was far from finished. "I see someone who's so insecure about his own talent that he has to tear down real artists to make himself feel important. I see someone who's forgotten that being a host means serving your guests and your audience, not using them as fodder for your own ego." The studio was so quiet now that you could hear a pin drop. Even the camera operators seemed transfixed by what they were witnessing. "And you know what the saddest part is, Jimmy?" Walton asked, his voice softening just slightly. "You actually had the opportunity to have a real conversation tonight. You could have asked me about my craft, about my experiences, about the things I've learned in this business. Instead, you chose to be small, petty, and mean." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his television career, he was completely speechless. "So here's what's going to happen," Walton announced, straightening up to his full height. "I'm going to walk off this stage with my dignity intact. You're going to sit there and think about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of show you want to host." Walton began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled. "And your audience is going to remember this moment as the night they saw what you're really like when you think no one important is watching." "Walton, wait," Jimmy said desperately, finally finding his voice again. "We can fix this. We can start over." Walton paused, looking back at Jimmy with something that might have been pity. "Jimmy, some things can't be fixed. Some mistakes can't be undone. Tonight you showed everyone who you really are, and that's something you're going to have to live with." "Please," Jimmy said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice now. "Don't do this." "I'm not doing anything, Jimmy," Walton replied calmly. "You did this. You chose to be a bully instead of a host. You chose to be cruel instead of funny. You chose to be small instead of professional." With that, Walton placed his microphone on Jimmy's desk and began walking toward the stage exit. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of the most respected actors in Hollywood made his dignified exit from what had become a complete disaster. "Walton!" Jimmy called after him, his voice echoing through the studio. But Walton didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the desperate plea. He simply walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind a host who had just learned a very hard lesson about respect, professionalism, and the consequences of treating people badly. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, Jimmy sat alone at his desk, staring at the microphone Walton had left behind, finally understanding that some lines should never be crossed. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen a guest completely dominate a host like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more wild celebrity stories that you won't believe actually happened.